Hi all. You may have gotten to the end of the syllabus this semester and thought that, it might be a little bit weird that I'm assigning Star Wars in what's supposed to be kind of a serious literature course. And in some ways, it might be just a little bit silly, but in truth, I am offering it here as a bit of a break from Moby Dick and as kind of a reward for getting through a course with a lot of challenging reading and dense topics to discuss. But the choice is also quite deliberate and meaningful. Because in this lecture, I'm going to kind of argue that, like Moby Dick, Star Wars is a repository of pretty much all of the aspects of Romanticism that we have talked about this semester. Just as Moby Dick is among the most important and influential literary achievements to come out of the original Romantic period, I'm going to suggest here that Star Wars is one of the most influential contributions to the extended Romantic tradition in the United States. Maybe not the most profound or the deepest, but certainly one of the most influential. However, for the purposes of this presentation, I'm going to ask that we do something that can often be just a little bit difficult to do, which is to kind of try to imagine what it was like in 1977 when the original Star Wars first came out. So when the prequel trilogy and the sequel trilogy and the books and the spin-off series and all of the accumulated Star Wars mythology were still really long in the future. Because, like Harry Potter and Lord of the Rings, Star Wars has become this mass cultural phenomenon. And so we have come to kind of recognize its visual and narrative tropes as belonging uniquely to itself. We tend to think more about how Star Wars has influenced other forms of popular culture rather than what influenced Star Wars in the first place, how it both drew on and departed from what had come before it. I'm going to talk about that a little bit today. Likewise, these big cultural phenomena have come to feel so timeless and eternally contemporary that it can be difficult to remember that they actually did have a particular context. That, for example, the mythology of the Lord of the Rings was partially conceived while J.R.R. Tolkien was serving in the British Army during the Battle of the Somme in the First World War. And so those books have a lot to do with both world wars, in fact. And I don't want to pick on Vladimir here, but it occurred to me that after his presentation on Harry Potter, that Harry Potter really is not a product of your generation. It's appreciated by your generation, but Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone was published in 1998, which is when I was a teenager and before most of you guys were even born. J.K. Rowling is about the same age as most of your parents. And that it appeals to your generation is unmistakable, and it's worth considering the reasons why. And so I think his presentation is definitely still valid. But the period in history that produced Harry Potter mostly occurred before your time. Therefore, Star Wars is kind of, here's J.K. Rowling. Star Wars is to my generation essentially what Harry Potter is to yours. I was born in 1982, the year before The Return of the Jedi was released. And while Star Wars feels like it was a very important and ever present piece of my childhood and adolescence, it's so largely because my parents experienced and loved it first. My dad was the one who first showed me a Star Wars film. Therefore, what I'm going to try to do in this presentation is think not about what Star Wars means to us now, especially now that it's become kind of, a Coca-Cola level economic powerhouse, but to think about what the original trilogy and especially the very first film were trying to do and how those films in particular are embedded in the Romantic tradition that we've been discussing all semester. So this presentation is going to be divided into three parts. And yes, the titles are intentionally a little bit mysterious. Okay, so let's start with a long time ago. So I'm going to claim here that Star Wars is superficially a science fiction film. It is a film that takes place in space with technology that is far beyond what we viewers have in our own lives. And by 1977, science fiction was a very popular genre that was finally achieving kind of a measure of respectability in literary and film circles. So the middle of the 20th century had given us authors like H.G. Wells, Ursula Le Guin, Isaac Asimov, Arthur C. Clarke, Philip K. Dick. These are all science fiction authors who wrote about big ideas, who were attempting to deal with very profound issues. And the late 1960s also gave us such films as Stanley Kubrick's 2001: A Space Odyssey and The Original Planet of the Apes. We also had the original Star Trek, starring William Shatner and Leonard Nimoy, which ran on television from 1966 to 1969. And science fiction was a really diverse genre at this time. but it tended to share some basic tropes, such as space travel, which is what Star Wars has in common with the science fiction of that time. But significantly for my argument, there seemed to be some basic agreement of this genre that science fiction is supposed to be about the future. Whether it's silly and fun science fiction that kind of looks to the future because we get all the cool technology, or if it's very serious science fiction that kind of projects the problems of our present society forward. This genre was fundamentally anticipatory, looking ahead at what was to come. Therefore, what makes Star Wars kind of unique in this context was that it is not a film about the future. Yes, this film has hyperlight space travel, laser swords, planet killing weapons, advanced robotics, but its setting is a long time ago, not the future, but the past. It does not attempt to project our current technology forward in a scientifically plausible way, nor does it try to project our society forward. Rather, insofar as these events depicted in the film happened a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, they have absolutely nothing to do with us, except perhaps in a mythological sense. And this is the first characteristic that I'm going to argue makes Star Wars a work of romantic art. It is fundamentally retrospective and nostalgic. George Lucas is not exploring our potential future. Rather, like James Fenimore Cooper and John Ford, he is creating a mythical past. Okay, so this nostalgic element of Star Wars works on two levels. It works both within the story and outside of it. So within the story, we have characters who live in a moment of strife and war. They are rebels fighting an overwhelming enemy with superior technology and a commitment to absolute order. They long for and seek salvation in the return of a class of warrior priests who used to lead them during, as Obi-Wan Kenobi characterizes it, a more civilized time. Star Wars is fundamentally about reviving a glorious past in face of the skeptics and the haters who either don't actually believe in the Force or who think it's kind of old and stupid. It's a story in which we're meant to understand that the characters who want to move on from the past and embrace the future are either misguided or evil. So, just as these characters are nostalgic for the glory days, so too are the filmmakers. Star Wars takes its visual tropes, including some of the ones that we most identify with Star Wars, from stuff that George Lucas enjoyed in his youth. For example, that opening title crawl that begins each film, a trope that we would recognize as a reference to or satire on Star Wars if we saw it in any other piece of media today, was actually taken from the original film serials for Flash Gordon and Buck Rogers in the 1930s and the 1940s. In fact, the decision to present the Star Wars films as episodes were taken directly from these franchises, which began as comic books and pulp novels and were eventually adapted into films that were presented as merely one episode in the long sweep of the Flash Gordon or the Buck Rogers sagas. Interestingly, according to the DVD commentary, when the first Star Wars film was produced, George Lucas had wanted to include the subtitle A New Hope in that opening crawl as a nod to the traditions of those earlier stories and kind of hinting at a larger mythology that existed at that point only in Lucas's imagination. However, 20th Century Fox forbade him from doing so, fearing that this reference to episodes would be confusing. It was supposed to be just sort of an homage to Flash Gordon and Buck Rogers, but 20th Century was like, why would you do that? There are no other episodes. Why are we giving them subtitles? So it was only when The Empire Strikes Back was released in 1981 that Star Wars films began using subtitles and episode numbers. So if you watch Star Wars today, the original Star Wars, you will see the subtitle A New Hope and an episode number. But these were actually added to the theatrical re-release of the original Star Wars in 1981 to go along with The Empire Strikes Back. We no longer have the theatrical print that was shown to people in theaters in 1977, but it did not include either the episode number or the subtitle. Okay? So, the mythology of Star Wars, consisting of Jedi Knights, princesses, and emperors, is also taken both from medieval romance and from samurai films, particularly the films of Akira Kurosawa, whom Lucas admired in film school. And on a more structural level, the narrative is inspired by Joseph Campbell's Hero with a Thousand Faces. You've probably heard this before. If you know a lot about Star Wars, this is the 1949 work of comparative mythology that defines the hero's journey and provides the entire formula for Luke's story, which is therefore kind of linked structurally and thematically to the arc of epic heroes dating all the way back to Gilgamesh. So when I said that Star Wars is only superficially a science fiction film, what I mean is that it has a science fiction setting, but its concerns are not the concerns of the kind of science fiction that was popular in the 1970s. Rather, it looks back to these pulp novels and comic books of the first half of the 20th century, as well as the tropes of historical romance and the structure of classical myths in order to create a film of truly epic scope. Okay, second argument. So, in addition to this retrospective attitude of the historical romance, Star Wars also borrows its setting from precisely the sort of films that we have discussed earlier in this semester. So, the desert setting of Tatooine is so iconic at this point that when J.J. Abrams began the first installment of the sequel trilogy on yet another desert planet, we immediately recognized it as a reference to the original film. But Tatooine is a desert planet for a reason, and that is because George Lucas was a big fan of David Lean's Lawrence of Arabia and John Ford's The Searchers. So, The Searchers you already know about, but in case you're unfamiliar with Lawrence of Arabia, it is a biographical film about T.E. Lawrence, the British officer who assisted Arab forces in their uprising against the Ottoman Empire. And so it fits within that tradition of narratives about Western men assimilating into non Western cultures that we discussed when we watched Dances of Wolves. And in fact, the Native American actor Russell Means actually derisively called Dances with Wolves Lawrence of the Plains. You know, this meant to be yet another reference to white man goes and assimilates with a non Western culture and sort of becomes their savior, that kind of narrative trope. So the aesthetic of Tatooine with its barren, windswept dunes is taken directly from this film. And from the Searchers, Lucas borrows not only the desert setting, but also the whole idea of these farmer settlers scratching out a living in a completely hostile landscape where they are threatened by local native tribes. The scene in which Luke comes back to the farm to find it destroyed and his relatives dead is a direct visual quotation from the scene in which Ethan Edwards returns to find that his brother's family has been slaughtered. And in fact, Lucas brings the Searchers back yet again in Attack of the Clones, when Anakin returns to Tatooine to find out that his mother has been kidnapped and ultimately killed by Tusken Raiders, a discovery that incites him, like Ethan, to a genocidal fury. And that's pretty much all I'm going to say about the prequels. There are also many other Western tropes in this film that don't necessarily reference the Searchers. So the planets where our rebels hide out are on the frontiers of the Empire. It's a lawless space where smugglers and bounty hunters and local gangsters operate with impunity, and shootouts happen in bars. Han Solo is the kind of cynical, morally ambiguous, and hyper competent hero who also happens to understand the language of many alien races that we can recognize from many of John Wayne's roles and from Hawkeye of Cooper's novels. So, to the degree that the setting of Star Wars has anything to do with us, it's not really with our future, but with our heavily mythologized past. Finally, use the Force, Luke. So, the whole religion and mythology of the Jedi and the Sith had many points of inspiration, again, as you likely know if you're familiar with Star Wars. So, in its broadest outlines, it's an adaptation of Buddhism, shamanism, some Hindu mythology, and also the warrior ethic of the samurai and the Shaolin monks. And as you know by now from this class, George Lucas was hardly the only American to take his Eastern religion and philosophy and adapt them to this kind of purpose. So it places him in the exact same tradition as Gary Snyder and Jack Kerouac and the 19th century transcendentalists. So as we learn from this film, the Jedi religion is pantheistic, believing that the spiritual essence of the universe inhabits basically everything. The prequels, of course, okay, I'm going to say one more thing about the prequels. It kind of attempted to introduce this sciency sounding explanation for the Force with midichlorians, and fans, at least at the time, generally hated it. If you like the concept of midichlorians, that's fine, but at the time it was really derided by a lot of critics and fans of this series, and that's because, at least in my opinion, we don't look to Star Wars for good science. Again, it's only superficially science fiction. Rather, it's more compelling when it's mysterious. We want there to be something kind of spiritual and nebulous about the Force. We don't really want to know that there's some biological explanation for it. Okay, the end of my digression. So, the Jedi religion also takes from Buddhism and transcendentalism this idea that your sense experience is unreliable. As Obi-Wan says, your eyes can deceive you, and that the truths of existence can only be known through intuition. He says, act on instinct, let go your conscious self, stretch out with your feelings. It's feelings rather than the stuff that we normally associate with like empiricism or rationalism that gives one true mastery over one's surroundings and enables one to solve problems. And we're consistently shown episodes in which it's Luke's feelings, his instincts, his just sensing something within himself that overcomes the overwhelming technological might of the Empire. So if at this point you're still not convinced that Star Wars is fundamentally a romantic film, recall that this is a science fiction film in which the hero of the story wins by turning off his computer and defeating the Death Star basically with his feelings, okay, with his intuitions, okay? So that's where I'm going to kind of end it. There's a great deal that I haven't included in this argument. I haven't talked very much about Luke and his journey, how he's kind of a rebellious teenager. If you would like to try to make some analogy between him and some of the guys we have looked at, Chris McCandless, earlier in this semester, then I would like you to go ahead and do that in the online discussion. I want you to kind of help me out here and go and look for examples or threads of analysis that I haven't explored here. This is just kind of to get you started. On the other hand, if you think I'm completely off base here, if you think this really has no place in the Romantic tradition, then I encourage you to tell me why I am wrong as well. I'm looking forward to an interesting conversation about this, and if you guys want to bring in some of the prequels or the sequel series or other elements of it and talk about how they are or are not romantic, I'm okay with that too. Although I would say that discussion leaders for Thursday, don't try to hold your group responsible for the entire Star Wars mythology. I have only assigned this one film. And yes, there are people who have never seen this before or are not acquainted with all of the different aspects of Star Wars. So try to keep it to maybe just the original trilogy if you're going to talk about Star Wars in your discussion. So I'm really looking forward to this. Thank you again for sticking with me this entire semester. And I wish all of you the best of luck.